Let's go through the disassembly, cleaning, and inspection of the HAG tool. First thing I'm going to do is remove the end cap and the gauge stick. Those two out of the way. Get the gauge stick out of the end cap. So in the past, some folks have run into having the knurled end of the gauge stick actually recessed down into the cap. And if you do have that happen, you're going to remove the two together and then just lightly tap on the bottom of the gauge stick, get it out of there and get it removed. So set those two aside. Next piece up is going to be removing the machine tube from the ground shaft. Get that out of there. Just a quick wipe down to get rid of some grease to handle it a little bit easier. And that brings me to the receiver and the T-bolt. So I'm going to go ahead and remove the thread cap from the T-bolt. And to get the T-bolt removed from the receiver, we're going to use a non-ball end 3mm hex key and get that broken free. There is Loctite applied to this screw when they're assembled. Here's my set screw, set it aside, and go ahead and remove the T-bolt from the receiver. And the last two items that I'm going to remove prior to cleaning are going to be two O-rings. The first O-ring is recessed inside the non-threaded end of the machined tube. Sneak that out of there. And the second O-ring is recessed down inside the tapered end of the cap. Just using a dental probe to get these out of there. All right. My two O-rings. So that's as far as I'm going to disassemble. And for cleaning, I'm going to go ahead and use some isopropyl alcohol, a little shop rag. I'm going to clean everything down and then go through the inspection process. So clean the ground shaft there and clean up the T-bolt, focusing on the machine groove in the T-bolt as well as the threads that interact with the derailleur hanger. Clean up my gauge stick. Set screw. And I want to try to get the inside of the machine tube cleaned up really nicely. And I've just got a couple of pieces of cleaning cloth, same idea, a little bit of rubbing alcohol on there, and send that through that tube. We want this surface to be as clean as possible for when we put the tool back together. So the second one's going to be dry. Okay. For the standpoint of inspecting for wear, the first thing I want to identify is any wear that may take place on the T-bolt. So I want to just take a quick look at the machine groove. And that's the groove that the set screw is going to interact with. Looks good. The threads still look like they're in good shape to interact with the derailleur hanger. Now on the ground shaft, the inspection aspect of this, or really what we're looking for, is any damage or imperfections that are raised above the surface of the ground shaft. So this one doesn't have anything there, but if I identified some imperfections or damage, what I want to do is only remove the high point. And to do that, I can use some fine grade sandpaper or a Scotch-Brite cloth, and I want to try and wrap as much of that cloth or sandpaper as I can around the shaft. Cycle it a few times, remove it, see how much progress you've made. You're only looking to remove the high points on there. Again, this tool doesn't show any signs of wear there, so it's looking pretty good. And that's going to be the disassembly, cleaning, and inspection of the HAG. So let's go ahead and put the HAG tool back together. I'm going to start out by installing the T-bolt into the receiver, and I'm going to do the best I can to align the machine groove with the threaded hole in the receiver. Got some bearing grease, just in a grease gun, single pump in there, and I mentioned a disassembly that there's Loctite applied to the set screw when they're assembled. So what we're using here is a 262 Loctite with an almost empty bottle. And drop onto the threads there, and then get that threaded into the receiver. And the process of achieving a good adjustment on this is going to be making lots of small incremental adjustments. So I want to identify it as the T-bolt rotate freely and smoothly inside the receiver, and it does. And the next thing I want to try and identify is their lateral play between the head of the receiver and the T-bolt itself. And I've got a little bit of lateral play in there. So I'm just going to use that 3mm non-ball end and tighten that set screw 1 or 2 degrees at a time. Really, really small adjustment. Still got a little play. Just a small amount. Okay, now it's really hard to tell if I'm feeling a little bit of play or not, and what I may be feeling at this point, the T-bolt rotates really freely. It's hard to identify if there's any lateral play between the T-bolt and the receiver. What I may be feeling is that the threads on the set screw are rocking against the threads in the receiver. So if you're happy with the adjustment, what you can do is go through the rest of the reassembly, set it aside, let that Loctite cure, and then come back and reevaluate your adjustment on there. So that feels good for now. And the next pieces are going to be reinstalling those O-rings into the main tube and the cap. So I'm going to start by using the base of the machine shaft and sliding it into machine tube, and I just want to get that as close to the bottom of the O-ring gland as I can. So I've got that lined up pretty well, and I'm going to take my O-ring, I'm going to go ahead and pop it back in place, and if you can't reach in there and set it right away, you can just use that 3mm, help get that O-ring seated into the gland in there. Okay, that feels really nice. The second O-ring is going to be into the tapered end of the cap. What I'm going to use is the gauge stick. I'm going to try and achieve the same thing I just did in having the gauge stick at the very bottom of the O-ring gland. And I've got my smaller diameter O-ring. I'm going to start to push that down in there. And I found you can just use a piece of derailleur housing with an end cap on it. And that should seat that O-ring very easily for you. So those are seated in there nicely. And to finalize the reassembly, I'm going to take another pump of my bearing grease and I'm going to put it above the O-ring in the machine tube. And as I install the non-threaded end of the machine tube onto the ground shaft, I'm going to give it a spin, get that grease to cover that O-ring, and get some good coverage all the way down the length of the tool. Next, I'm going to install the cap. And get my gauge stick in there. And then finally, take the thread cap, pop it off the T-bolt handle, put it onto the threads, and there's a HAG that's ready to go back into service.